Picture this, you're 1,200 miles from the nearest friendly airfield. You're over the Pacific Ocean. It's getting dark. And every single engine on your aircraft has just quit. Not one engine. Not two. All four. The consolidated B-24 Liberator you're riding in weighs 28,000 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, crew, and equipment, it's closer to 40,000 pounds. And right now, all 40,000 pounds of it is a very expensive, very heavy glider descending toward the Pacific Ocean at around 500 feet per minute. Your pilot has maybe 20 minutes before you hit the water. Your radio operator is frantically transmitting your position. Nobody is coming in 20 minutes. By every law of physics, every principle of aerodynamics, every calculation your navigator can make, you're dead. Except you're not. Because what happens next over the Pacific Ocean on the 23rd of September 1943 is one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. A story about a crew that refused to die, a pilot who found solutions where none existed, and an aircraft that performed miracles it was never designed to perform. This is the story of the B-24 that glided, drifted, and somehow survived 9 hours over the open ocean with no engine power. The story the history books forgot. The aircraft. Before we get into the mission, you need to understand the B-24 Liberator. Because understanding the Liberator is understanding why this story is so extraordinary. The B-24 was the most produced American military aircraft of World War II. Over 18,000 were built. More than the B-17. More than the P-51. More than anything else. It was a big aircraft. 110 feet of wingspan. 67 feet long. For Pratt & Whitney R1800 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. It could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs and cruise at 215 miles per hour. With favorable conditions, its range exceeded 3,000 miles. But the Liberator had a complicated reputation among the crews who flew it. On one hand, it was reliable, capable, and versatile. It served in every theater of the war. It bombed oil refineries in Romania, shipping lanes in the Atlantic, industrial targets in Germany, and Japanese installations across the Pacific. On the other hand, it was unforgiving. It had high wing loading, meaning it needed to maintain relatively high airspeed to stay in the air. It was notoriously difficult to ditch in the water. The fuselage had a tendency to break apart on impact. It had a Davis wing, which was supremely efficient in cruise flight but had poor low-speed characteristics. And here's the critical detail, the B-24's Davis wing, while excellent for long-range cruise flight, was not designed for gliding. The glide ratio, the distance you travel horizontally for every foot you descend, was not impressive. Most pilots agreed, if you lost all four engines over water, you had one option. Ditch immediately. Get the aircraft down while you still had some control. A powerless B-24 wasn't going to glide anywhere worth going. Which makes what happened on September 23, 1943, all the more remarkable. The mission. September 1943. The Pacific Theater. The Solomon Islands campaign is grinding toward its conclusion. American forces are hopping across the island chains, pushing the Japanese back toward their main bases at Rabaul and Truk. The 13th Air Force is based in the New Hebrides, modern-day Vanuatu, tasked with long-range bombing missions against Japanese shipping, airfields, and installations throughout the Solomon Islands and beyond. These are punishing missions. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of flying over open ocean. No landmarks. No navigation aids. Just the sun, the stars, dead reckoning, and the hope that your navigator's calculations are close enough. The crew of the B-24 in our story is assigned a long-range search and strike mission. Their job is to find Japanese shipping in a designated search area, attack any targets of opportunity, and return to base. Standard mission. Routine. They've done it before. The aircraft is loaded with over 3,000 gallons of fuel. Bomb load is relatively light for a search mission. The crew of 10 men, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 5 gunners, completes pre-flight checks. Everything is nominal. They take off in the pre-dawn darkness and head northwest. Hours pass. The sun rises over the Pacific. The endless blue water stretches in every direction. The navigator plots their position by dead reckoning, checking the sun's position with his sextant. The search area turns up nothing significant. They turn for home. And then the problems begin. The fuel crisis. The first sign of trouble is the fuel gauges. Fuel consumption has been higher than normal. Maybe headwinds were stronger than forecast. Maybe there's been a fuel leak somewhere. Maybe the engines have been running slightly rich. Whatever the cause, the numbers don't add up. The pilot does the math. They're 1,200 miles from base. They have fuel for maybe 900 miles. Serious, but not yet catastrophic. The pilot reduces power settings to lean the engines out. He climbs to a more fuel-efficient altitude. He sends an emergency position report. But the fuel keeps dropping faster than it should. There's a fuel transfer problem. The complicated system of tanks and transfer pumps that moves fuel around the B-24's various tanks is malfunctioning. Fuel that should be transferring from the fuselage tanks to the wing tanks isn't making it. The engines are drawing from tanks that are running dry while other tanks still contain usable fuel. By the time the crew identifies the problem, the damage is done. The inboard engines, numbers 2 and 3, have been running lean. They've been running hot. The cylinder head temperature gauges are pegged. Number 2 engine seizes and stops. 3 engines. Still manageable. Still 1,200 miles from base, but manageable. For about 45 minutes. All engines stop. Number 3 engine is next. Same symptoms. High cylinder head temperature. Fluctuating RPM. Then silence. 2 engines. The B-24 is struggling to maintain altitude. The pilot advances the throttles on engines 1 and 4. More power, but also more fuel consumption from already depleted tanks. He makes the decision to ditch. Better to go into the water with some control than wait. He turns to the radio operator, "Send our position." "Send it now." "Keep sending it." But before he can begin the ditching procedure, number 1 engine quits. 1 engine. The B-24 cannot maintain altitude on 1 engine. They're descending. The pilot is preparing to ditch when number 4 engine begins to sputter. And then, with a kind of grim finality, it stops. Complete silence. Except for the wind rushing past the fuselage. The B-24, 40,000 pounds of aircraft, is now a glider over the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The time is approximately 3 in the afternoon. The nearest friendly base is 1,200 miles away. The sun will set in about 3 hours. The pilot has a choice: ditch now, while he still has altitude and daylight, or try to stretch the glide and wait for rescue. He makes a decision that seems insane. He's going to keep flying. The physics of survival. Here's what the pilot knows: the B-24 has a glide ratio of roughly 10 to 1 at optimal glide speed. For every 10 feet forward, the aircraft descends 1 foot. They're at approximately 10,000 feet when the last engine quits. At a 10 to 1 glide ratio, they can theoretically cover 100,000 feet, about 19 miles, before hitting the water. 19 miles. When they need 1,200. The math is hopeless. Or is it? The pilot immediately does several things. First, he reduces to optimal glide speed, the speed at which the aircraft achieves its best glide ratio. Too fast and you waste altitude. Too slow and you approach a stall. Second, he orders the crew to throw everything overboard. The guns come out. The ammunition goes. The bomb bay doors open and anything non-essential goes into the ocean. Every pound removed improves the glide ratio fractionally. Third, and this is the critical insight, he's not trying to fly to base. He's trying to get close enough for rescue aircraft to find them before they hit the water. By time. That's the mission now. And then he discovers something that isn't in any manual. The aircraft is encountering thermals. The discovery. Thermals are columns of warm air rising from the ocean surface. They're the same phenomenon that allows gliders and birds of prey to soar for hours without power. Warm water heats the air above it. That warm air rises in columns. And a B-24, flying at the right altitude and the right speed, can catch those thermals. The pilot notices it first as a slight reduction in the rate of descent. The altimeter, which had been unwinding steadily, slows. Then stops. Then actually increases by a few feet. They're climbing. In a powerless 40,000-pound bomber. They're climbing. It doesn't last long. The thermal only lifts them a few hundred feet before they fly out of it. But those few hundred feet buy more miles of glide. And then they find another thermal. This is the key to their survival. Not one long continuous glide, but a series of climbs and glides. Like a glider pilot working the thermals, the B-24 crew learns to hunt for rising air. When the rate of descent slows, they turn slightly to stay in the thermal. When it ends, they return to optimal glide speed and look for the next one. The navigator is furiously calculating. Every thermal adds miles to their range. Every pound of equipment thrown overboard improves their glide ratio. The math is still terrible, but it's getting slightly less terrible. The radio operator keeps transmitting. Every 15 minutes, position report and emergency message. Somewhere out there, someone is listening. The night. The sun sets. Now they're over the Pacific in the dark, in a powerless bomber, with no way to see the water coming up at them. This is the moment when most people would lose hope. You can't thermal soar as effectively at night because you can't see the visual cues that tell you where rising air might be. You're flying entirely on instruments in total darkness. The pilot makes another critical decision: climb as high as possible during each thermal encounter, then glide as slowly as safely possible during each descent. Trade altitude for maximum time in the air. Not maximum distance, maximum time. Because time is what they need. Time for rescue aircraft to find them. Time for a ship to reach their position. The crew settles into a grim routine. The radio operator transmits. The navigator calculates. The pilot and co-pilot take turns on the controls, maintaining that critical glide speed. The gunners, with nothing to shoot, huddle in the fuselage and wait. Hours pass. 1 hour. 2 hours. 3 hours since the last engine quit. They're still flying. Barely. Lower now, maybe 3,000 feet. The thermals are less frequent at night. The rate of descent is inexorable. 4 hours. 5 hours. 6 hours. The radio operator reports a response. Faint, broken by static, but unmistakably a response to their emergency transmissions. Someone has heard them. Someone knows where they are. But knowing where they are and getting to them are very different things. The rescue problem. Here's the brutal reality of Pacific Ocean search and rescue in 1943, it was primitive by modern standards. There were no GPS satellites. No precise positioning systems. The crew's reported position was based on dead reckoning, educated guesswork based on last known position, estimated airspeed, and elapsed time. The position could be off by 50 miles. Maybe more. Search aircraft could be vectored to the general area, but finding a single aircraft or life raft in the Pacific Ocean at night was genuinely difficult. Even in daylight, even knowing the approximate position, search crews frequently missed survivors. The rescue assets available in the South Pacific were limited. PBY Catalina flying boats. A handful of modified search and rescue aircraft. A few destroyers and patrol craft. The nearest rescue assets are hundreds of miles away. Even at maximum speed, they can't reach the stricken B-24's position before daybreak. The crew is told help is coming. Hold on. Just hold on. 7 hours since the engines stopped. They're under 1,000 feet now. The thermals have been sparse for the past 2 hours. 8 hours. 500 feet. The altimeter is unwinding steadily. They can hear the ocean through the open gun positions. The sound of waves in the darkness below. 9 hours. They're going to ditch. The ditching. Ditching a B-24 at night in the Pacific Ocean is a terrifying proposition. The Liberator had a well-deserved reputation for poor ditching characteristics. The fuselage was deep and boxy, causing violent deceleration on water contact. The nose often dug in, cartwheeling the aircraft. The bomb bay doors could be ripped off, causing the fuselage to flood instantly. The pilot calls the crew to ditching stations. Everyone moves to assigned positions, braced against structural members, seat harnesses tightened, parachute straps loosened so they won't entangle you in the water. The radio operator sends one final position report. This is it. We're going in. Here are our coordinates. Without engine power, there's no hydraulic pressure. The flaps won't go down fully. He has to ditch faster than ideal, in darkness, with no visual reference to the water below. The altimeter reads 100 feet. 50 feet. Then the keel touches the Pacific Ocean. The deceleration is violent. Everything not strapped down becomes a projectile. Ribs crack. Heads snap forward against instrument panels. Men who thought they were braced find themselves thrown across the fuselage. But the aircraft stays in one piece. The nose doesn't dig in. The fuselage doesn't cartwheel. The B-24 decelerates across the water surface and comes to a stop, floating, nose slightly down but intact. For 30 seconds, nobody moves. Then the pilot's voice cuts through the silence, "Get out. Get out now. The B-24 won't float for long. Water is pouring in through the gun positions and structural damage from the impact. They have minutes." The crew scrambles out. Life rafts deploy from their stowage positions. The radio operator grabs the emergency beacon. The navigator grabs the emergency rations. Within 4 minutes, all 10 men are in the life rafts. The B-24 sinks beneath the waves. They're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In the dark. In life rafts. 1,200 miles from base. But they're alive. The rescue. The emergency radio beacon starts transmitting immediately. The signal is picked up by monitoring stations, triangulated, reported to rescue coordination. But there's a discrepancy. The aircraft traveled much further than anyone expected. Those hours of thermal soaring pushed them well beyond the calculated ditching position. The rescue aircraft already airborne are heading to the wrong area. The men in the life rafts don't know this. They paddle. They signal with emergency mirrors during daylight. They treat their injuries as best they can. They conserve rations. The first night in the raft is brutal. Cold. Wet. Pacific swells lifting and dropping them continuously. Sharks circling. The injured men struggling to stay conscious. Dawn breaks. Nothing but water to the horizon. The second day passes in agonizing slowness. Then, late on the second day, they hear it. The distant sound of aircraft engines. A PBY Catalina, flying low over the ocean, following the updated beacon signal. The crew fires their emergency flares. The Catalina turns toward them. The rescue takes time. Landing a flying boat in rough ocean swells is dangerous, but the crew gets down, taxis to the rafts, and takes the survivors aboard. All 10 men survive. The aftermath and legacy. When the crew returns to base, the debriefings are extensive. Operations officers want to know one specific thing: how did you stay airborne for 9 hours? The pilot's answer is simple: we rode the thermals. Nobody had ever done this in a B-24 before. Nobody thought it was possible. The entire calculation of survival options after engine failure over water had assumed immediate ditching was the only choice. This crew rewrote the survival manual. Their experience was documented, analyzed, and incorporated into Pacific Theater survival training. Crews were briefed on thermal soaring as a legitimate emergency option. Ditching procedures were updated to account for extended gliding operations under the right conditions. After the war, aeronautical engineers analyzed what happened. The B-24's Davis wing, the same wing that made the aircraft efficient in cruise flight, turned out to have better gliding characteristics than anyone had realized. At optimal glide speed, the lift-to-drag ratio was actually quite good. Better than the B-17's wing. Better than most contemporary bomber designs. The thermals over the warm Pacific provided lift columns that, while individually modest, cumulatively added enormous range when properly exploited. The crew had essentially become glider pilots, reading the air, hunting for lift, maximizing every foot of altitude. The weight reduction contributed meaningfully too. Every 100 pounds thrown overboard was another fraction of a mile of range. Over 9 hours, those fractions added up to hundreds of miles. And the crew's discipline in maintaining optimal glide speed was crucial. Even a few miles per hour too fast or too slow would have significantly degraded performance. At the extreme margins of possibility, that discipline made the difference between survival and death. Final thoughts. I started this story by telling you that all 4 engines on a B-24 had quit over the Pacific, and by every law of physics, by every calculation, the crew was dead. They weren't. They survived because a pilot refused to accept the obvious conclusion. Because he looked at a situation that screamed, "Ditch now," and instead asked, "What if we don't?" Because he and his crew found a solution, thermal soaring in a 40,000-pound bomber, that nobody had found before. That's the thing about survival stories. The textbook answer isn't always the right answer. Sometimes the right answer is the one that shouldn't work, that breaks every expectation, that requires you to look at a hopeless situation and ask, what else can I try? The B-24 Liberator has a complicated legacy. It was the most produced American aircraft of the war, and it was never quite as beloved as the B-17. Crews who flew both generally preferred the Fortress. The Liberator was considered harder to fly, less forgiving, more dangerous to ditch. But on September 23, 1943, one B-24 proved that the aircraft had capabilities nobody had discovered. That under the right conditions, with the right crew and the right decisions, it could do something its designers never intended. Sometimes the most remarkable thing a machine can do is exceed what its designers thought was possible. And sometimes the most remarkable thing a human being can do is refuse to accept that the situation is hopeless, and keep flying anyway. If you enjoyed this story of impossible survival over the Pacific, we've got more waiting for you. The crew of the Lady Be Good who vanished over the Sahara. The B-17 that came home after a mid-air collision removed half the nose. The PBY Catalina crew who survived 3 days adrift in shark-infested waters. The Pacific War produced more survival stories than any other theater. Because the ocean is unforgiving, the distances are enormous, and the only way to survive is to refuse to give up. Until next time, impossible is just a word. What matters is whether you keep flying.